The morning fog clung to the headstones like whispered secrets refusing to fade. Margaret Chen stood alone in the cemetery, her black coat buttoned against the October chill, clutching a bouquet of white orchids that trembled slightly in her grip. She hadn't been here in 3 years. 3 years since the funeral. 3 years since she'd allowed herself to remember the woman she'd once promised forever. The granite marker was simple, elegant, exactly what Sarah would have wanted. Sarah Marie Chen, beloved daughter, devoted partner, taken too soon. Before they even begin, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's throat constricted as she knelt, brushing fallen leaves from the stone's surface with fingers that had signed billion-dollar contracts, but now shook with something far more valuable than money. Grief she'd never properly faced. She'd built an empire to forget. Chen Technologies had grown from a startup in their garage to a global force in renewable energy, but every success felt hollow without Sarah there to celebrate it. Margaret had thrown herself into quarterly reports and product launches, into 18-hour days and red-eye flights, into anything that kept her from returning to this quiet hill where the truth waited beneath the earth. The orchid slipped from her hands as tears finally came, hot and unexpected. She'd thought herself beyond crying, had armored herself in spreadsheets and shareholder meetings, but grief had patience. It waited. It always waited. That's when she heard them. Small footsteps on gravel, hushed whispers, the unmistakable sound of children trying to be quiet and failing beautifully at it. Margaret wiped her eyes quickly, composing herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to hide vulnerability in boardrooms. She turned, expecting to see a family visiting their own departed, perhaps taking a shortcut through the cemetery paths. Instead, 3 little girls emerged from behind a massive oak tree, their faces smudged with dirt, their clothes mismatched and worn. They couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, moving with the cautious curiosity of sparrows approaching breadcrumbs. But it was what they carried that made Margaret's breath catch. Each child held flowers. Wilted dandelions, probably picked from the roadside. Stems clutched in small fists. Petals drooping, but offered with the kind of sincere intention that made them more precious than any hothouse arrangement. The tallest of the 3, with dark hair pulled into an uneven ponytail, stepped forward first. Her eyes were large and solemn, the kind of eyes that had seen too much too soon. She looked at Margaret, then at the gravestone, then back again. "Are you visiting someone you miss?" the girl asked, her voice clear despite its softness. Margaret found herself nodding before she could construct the walls she usually hid behind. Something about these children disarmed her completely. They had an air of loneliness that matched her own, a sadness that seemed too heavy for such young shoulders. "Yes," Margaret finally managed. "My wife." The middle child, slightly shorter with wild curls escaping from beneath a knitted cap, tilted her head. "We're visiting our mama, too. She's over there." She pointed toward a section of newer graves, where the grass was still establishing itself and the headstones gleamed with recent polish. The third girl, the smallest, hadn't spoken yet. She simply stared at Margaret with eyes the color of storm clouds, holding her handful of dandelions like they were made of glass. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in the dam she'd built. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. The tall girl shrugged with the false bravery of a child pretending to be strong. "It's been 4 months. People say it gets easier, but I don't think that's true yet." "It's not," Margaret admitted, abandoning the comforting lies adults usually told children. "It just gets different." A moment of understanding passed between them, the kind that transcends age and circumstance. These 3 small strangers understood what her entire executive team never could. That grief was not a problem to be solved or a weakness to overcome, but a companion that changed shape over time. "What are your names?" Margaret asked, surprising herself. She never engaged with strangers, had built a reputation for being brilliant but distant, capable but cold. Yet something about this fog-draped morning and these peculiar children made her ordinary rules seem irrelevant. "I'm Sophie," the tallest said. "This is Emma." She gestured to the curly-haired middle child. "And that's Lily." The smallest girl gave a tiny wave, still clutching her dandelions. "I'm Margaret." She extended her hand formally, then felt foolish, but Sophie took it with surprising seriousness, shaking it like a business partner sealing a deal. "You look sad," Emma observed with the blunt honesty only children possess. "Really, really sad. Like the kind of sad that lives inside your bones." Margaret let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "That's exactly what it feels like." Lily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mama used to say that sadness is just love with nowhere to go." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had to turn away, pressing her palm against Sarah's headstone for support. Love with nowhere to go. Yes, that was precisely it. She had an ocean of love that had nowhere to land, no recipient, no purpose. It just swirled inside her, corrosive and beautiful and utterly useless. When she'd composed herself enough to face the girls again, she found them watching her with concern rather than discomfort. They didn't look away from her tears or try to change the subject. They simply witnessed her grief the way she was witnessing theirs, with quiet acceptance. "Would you like to see our mama's grave?" Sophie asked. "We brought flowers, but we don't really know what to say when we visit. Maybe you know the right words?" Margaret almost declined. She'd come here to be alone, to finally face what she'd been avoiding. But something in Sophie's hopeful expression, in the way all three girls looked at her like she might have answers they desperately needed, made her nod. "I don't know if I have the right words," she admitted, "but I'll come with you." They walked together through the cemetery, an unlikely procession. Margaret in her expensive coat and Italian leather boots. The three girls in their threadbare jackets and scuffed sneakers, all of them carrying flowers for the dead. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing more of the landscape. Rolling hills dotted with monuments to lives lived and lost, trees standing sentinel over memories carved in stone. The girls led her to a grave that looked newer than Sarah's, the earth still settling. The headstone simple granite with minimal inscription. "Rebecca Lynn Morrison, cherished mother, forever in our hearts." The dates showed she'd been only 32 when she died. So young, too young. The girls knelt, placing their wilted dandelions at the base of the stone with careful reverence. Margaret found herself kneeling beside them, setting her white orchids next to their humble offering. The contrast was stark. Her expensive blooms beside their roadside pickings, yet somehow the dandelions seemed more honest, more real. "Hi, Mama," Sophie said softly, her voice wavering. "We brought you flowers again, and we met a nice lady. Her name is Margaret, and she's sad like us." Emma leaned forward, touching the cold granite. "We miss you so much. Every single day feels long without you. Aunt Carol tries, but it's not the same. Nothing is the same." Lily said nothing, but tears streamed silently down her cheeks, catching the weak morning light. Margaret felt her own tears returning. She reached out instinctively, placing a hand on Lily's small shoulder. The child leaned into the touch like someone starving for comfort, and Margaret's heart twisted painfully. They sat in silence for several minutes, five souls united by loss, by the gaping absence of people they'd loved. Margaret found herself speaking, surprising herself again. "I don't come here often enough. I've been afraid to face how much I miss her. My wife, Sarah, she died 3 years ago, and I've spent all that time running, building my company bigger, working longer hours, traveling constantly. Anything to avoid sitting still with the pain." Sophie looked at her with ancient eyes. "Does the running work?" "No," Margaret admitted. "It just makes you tired." Emma nodded sagely. "That's what our social worker said. She told us that grief is like carrying a heavy backpack. You can try to pretend it's not there, but it just makes your shoulders hurt worse." "Your social worker sounds wise," Margaret said. "She is," Sophie replied. "But she's also trying to find us a permanent home. Aunt Carol can only keep us for another month. She says 3 kids is too many, especially with her own baby coming." The casual way Sophie delivered this devastating information made it somehow worse. These children were not only grieving their mother, but facing the dissolution of what remained of their family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And they spoke about it with a matter-of-fact tone of people who'd learned that tragedy requires no dramatic delivery. Margaret felt anger flare hot in her chest, unexpected and fierce. How could anyone look at these three remarkable children and see them as a burden rather than a gift? How could their own family consider them too much trouble? "I'm sorry," she said. Inadequate words for an inadequate situation. "That's not fair to you." "Life isn't fair," Emma said with a shrug. "That's what everyone keeps telling us anyway." They fell into silence again, but this time it felt less like grief and more like companionship. For people who understood that sometimes there are no right words, no comforting platitudes, only the shared experience of absence. Eventually, Sophie stood, brushing dirt from her worn jeans. "We should probably go. Aunt Carol will worry if we're gone too long." We snuck out while she was napping. Margaret rose as well, her knees protesting slightly. She was only 38, but felt decades older suddenly. Her carefully constructed life seeming frivolous next to the raw reality these children face daily. "May I walk you back?" she found herself offering. "I'd like to make sure you get home safely." The girls exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Sophie nodded. "Okay, it's not far. We live in the apartments on Riverside." Margaret knew the area. Working-class neighborhood, aging buildings, the kind of place she'd grown up in before education and ambition had lifted her into a different economic stratosphere. The kind of place she'd forgotten about in her marble-lobbied life. They walked together down the hill, leaving the cemetery behind. The fog had fully lifted now, revealing a gray autumn day threatening rain. The girls chattered quietly among themselves, occasionally including Margaret in their conversation with questions about her work, her home, whether she had pets. She found herself answering honestly, something she rarely did even with close colleagues. She told them about Chen Technologies, about her penthouse apartment overlooking the harbor, about the loneliness of success without someone to share it with. She told them things she'd never spoken aloud, truths that emerged effortlessly in the presence of these wise, wounded children. When they reached a tired-looking apartment complex with peeling paint and cracked concrete, the girls paused at the entrance. "Thank you for walking with us," Sophie said formally, "and for talking to us at the cemetery. Most adults act like we're invisible or made of glass. You treated us like real people." "You are real people," Margaret said. "Probably more real than most of the people I know." Emma grinned, revealing a missing tooth. "You're nice. Different than I expected a CEO to be. I thought you'd all be mean and wear scary business suits." Margaret looked down at her black coat and tailored trousers. "I'm wearing a business suit." "But you're not scary," Lily said quietly, speaking up for only the second time. "You're sad, but you're kind. I can tell." Something about those words, delivered with such certainty by this solemn little girl, undid Margaret completely. She found herself blinking back fresh tears, overwhelmed by a tenderness she hadn't felt in years. Not since Sarah died. Not since she'd locked away every soft part of herself to survive. "Can we see you again?" Sophie asked suddenly, her voice holding a note of hope that was almost painful to hear. "Maybe you could visit Mama with us sometimes? It's less scary when you're not alone." Margaret should have said no. She should have explained that she had board meetings and international calls, that she couldn't possibly commit to regular cemetery visits with 3 children she'd just met. She should have gently extricated herself from this unexpected entanglement before it became complicated. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'd like that very much." The girls' faces transformed, lit from within by genuine joy. It occurred to Margaret that she had perhaps just made the first purely emotional decision of her adult life, choosing connection over convenience, vulnerability over the safety of isolation. "Next Sunday?" Emma asked eagerly. "Same time. Next Sunday," Margaret confirmed, pulling out her phone. "Give me your aunt's number." I'll call to arrange it properly." Sophie rattled off the number, which Margaret saved carefully, her executive assistant brain already noting the commitment in her mental calendar. The girls waved enthusiastically as they disappeared into the apartment building, their small figures swallowed by the dim lobby. Margaret stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, rain beginning to fall in light drops, wondering what she'd just done. She'd come to the cemetery to mourn her past, to finally face the wife she'd lost. Instead, she'd found 3 children who seemed to need her as much as she suddenly realized she needed them. Her phone buzzed with messages from her assistant. Urgent matters requiring her attention, decisions only she could make, the endless machinery of her empire demanding its queen. But for once, Margaret didn't immediately respond. She simply stood in the rain, thinking about dandelions and orchids, about sadness being love with nowhere to go, about 3 little girls who'd somehow slipped past her defenses with their honesty and their grief that mirrored her own. When she finally returned to her car, a sleek black sedan that cost more than most people's annual salary, Margaret sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her makeup was smudged from crying, her hair disheveled from the wind, her carefully constructed mask completely fallen away. She looked human, breakable, real, and for the first time in 3 years, that didn't terrify her. The week that followed was surreal. Margaret attended meetings and signed contracts, gave presentations and approved budgets, but part of her mind remained in that fog-draped cemetery with 3 little girls and their wilted dandelions. She found herself distracted during conference calls, thinking about Sophie's ancient eyes and Emma's gap-toothed grin and Lily's whispered wisdom. On Wednesday, she called the number Sophie had given her. A tired-sounding woman answered, immediately suspicious when Margaret introduced herself. "Who are you again?" Carol Morrison asked, her voice sharp with the wariness of someone expecting bad news. "My name is Margaret Chen. I met your nieces at the cemetery on Sunday. They invited me to visit again this weekend, and I wanted to confirm that with you first." There was a long pause. "The girls mentioned you. Said some fancy lady talked to them about their mom." Carol's tone remained guarded. "Look, I don't know what your angle is, but those kids have been through enough without some stranger disrupting their lives." Margaret understood the protective instinct, even appreciated it, though it complicated things. "I have no angle, Ms. Morrison. I was visiting my late wife's grave when I met Sophie, Emma, and Lily. We connected over our shared loss. They asked if I'd accompany them on their next visit. That's all." "That's all," Carol repeated skeptically. "Lady, nothing is ever that's all when it comes to those 3. They're sweet kids, don't get me wrong, but they're a handful. And I'm trying to find them a good placement before my own baby comes. I can't take on more complications." The casual way Carol discussed finding a placement for her sister's children, as if they were furniture to be rehomed rather than grieving human beings, made Margaret's jaw tighten. But she kept her voice neutral. "I understand this is a difficult situation. I'm simply offering to provide some stability and companionship for a few hours this Sunday. Nothing more complicated than that." Another pause, then a sigh. "Fine, but make it afternoon. And don't make promises you won't keep. Those girls have had enough disappointment for one lifetime." The call ended abruptly, leaving Margaret staring at her phone, struck by the coldness in Carol's voice when discussing her nieces. She pulled up her contacts and called her assistant. "Julia, I need you to do some research for me. Quietly. The Morrison family, specifically 3 minor children currently in their aunt's care following their mother's death. I want to know about the custody situation, what options exist, what the timeline looks like." Julia, accustomed to Margaret's occasional odd requests, simply said, "Of course. How detailed should this research be?" "Extremely. I want to understand every legal avenue, every social service involved, every possibility for those children's future." When Margaret hung up, she felt the unfamiliar sensation of her heartbeat quickening with something that wasn't anxiety or stress. It took her a moment to recognize it. Purpose. For the first time since Sarah's death, she felt driven by something other than the need to escape her grief. Sunday arrived with clear skies, autumn sun painting the city gold and crimson. Margaret chose her clothes carefully, abandoning her usual severe business attire for casual slacks and a soft sweater. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone she barely recognized, a woman preparing for a meaningful engagement rather than armor for corporate warfare. She arrived at the Morrison apartment building 15 minutes early, nerves fluttering in her stomach. When was the last time she'd been nervous about anything? She'd negotiated with hostile boards and pitched to skeptical investors without breaking a sweat, yet the prospect of spending an afternoon with 3 grieving children had her hands trembling slightly. The girls burst from the building before she could knock, their faces radiant with excitement. They'd clearly dressed up for the occasion. Sophie in a faded dress that was too short for her growing frame, Emma in mismatched but clean clothes, Lily in overalls with a carefully patched knee. "You came," Emma shouted, throwing her arms around Margaret's waist with unconscious affection. Margaret stiffened for only a second before returning the embrace, her hands hovering uncertainly before settling on the child's shoulders. Physical affection had become foreign to her, but Emma's warmth was impossible to resist. "Of course I came," Margaret said. "I promised, didn't I?" "Adults break promises all the time," Sophie said matter-of-factly, though her eyes shone with relief. "It's nice when they don't." A woman appeared in the doorway, heavily pregnant and looking exhausted. Carol Morrison had the same dark hair as her nieces, but none of their light. Her face was drawn, her expression perpetually pinched, as if life had disappointed her so thoroughly that she expected nothing else. "You're the CEO lady," Carol said flatly. "Margaret Chen." "Yes. Thank you for allowing me to spend time with your nieces." Carol waved a dismissive hand. "Just have them back by 5. I need a rest before my shift tonight." She looked at the girls with something that might have been affection buried under layers of exhaustion and resentment. "Behave yourselves. Don't embarrass me." "We won't, Aunt Carol," Sophie promised, already pulling Margaret toward the parking lot. As they walked away, Margaret glanced back to see Carol retreating inside without a goodbye, the door closing with finality that felt symbolic. Those children were clearly an unwanted burden, love perhaps an abstract theory, but resented in daily practice. The girls clustered around Margaret's car, eyes wide at the sleek vehicle. "This is yours," Emma breathed, running her hand along the hood. "It's so shiny I can see my reflection." "It's just a car," Margaret said, but their wonder made her see it differently, through eyes that hadn't become jaded by wealth. The drive to the cemetery was filled with chatter. Emma narrated everything they passed, providing commentary on shops and parks and random strangers. Sophie asked thoughtful questions about Margaret's work, genuinely interested in renewable energy and business strategy. Lily sat quietly in the back, occasionally offering soft observations that were startlingly profound. At the cemetery, they fell into an easy rhythm. The girls led Margaret to their mother's grave, where they'd brought fresh flowers this time, purchased with quarters saved from allowances that Carol grudgingly provided. Margaret had brought white roses, elegant and simple, which she placed beside the children's offering. "Hi, Mama," Sophie began as she had before. "We brought Margaret again. She keeps her promises." They sat together on the grass, heedless of the damp ground, and talked. Not just to Rebecca's grave, but to each other. The girls shared stories about their mother, how she made the best pancakes, how she sang constantly even though she couldn't carry a tune, how she'd read to them every night without fail. Margaret found herself sharing memories of Sarah too, stories she'd buried along with her grief. She told them about Sarah's terrible sense of direction, how she'd gotten them lost on every vacation, about Sarah's obsession with terrible puns, her collection of houseplants she'd somehow managed to kill despite Margaret's best efforts to keep them alive, about the way Sarah had made their house feel like home simply by being in it. "She sounds wonderful," Sophie said softly. "I wish we could have met her." "She would have loved you," Margaret replied, and realized with a start that it was true. Sarah had always wanted children. They'd been planning to start a family when the cancer diagnosis came, brutal and final, stealing their future before they could even properly imagine it. Emma leaned against Margaret's shoulder, a natural gesture of affection that made Margaret's breath catch. "You're alone like us, aren't you? Even though you're a grown-up with a big job and everything." "Yes," Margaret admitted. "I'm alone like you. But maybe," Lily whispered, "we could be alone together sometimes. Like this. It feels less lonely when you share it." Margaret wrapped her arm around the small girl, pulling her close, and felt something long frozen begin to thaw in her chest. "I like that very much." They stayed for hours, far longer than Margaret had planned. They talked and were silent, laughed and cried, remembered and imagined. By the time they left, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. On the drive back, the girls dozed in the car, exhausted from emotion and fresh air. Margaret glanced at them in the rearview mirror, their peaceful faces, their small bodies relaxed in sleep, and felt protective fierceness rise in her chest. When they arrived at the apartment, Carol was waiting outside, smoking a cigarette and checking her phone impatiently. "About time," she said when they pulled up. "I've got to get to work." The girls tumbled out, still sleepy but smiling. They hugged Margaret goodbye, each embrace lasting longer than seemed appropriate for people who'd known each other only a week. "Same time next Sunday?" Sophie asked hopefully. "Same time," Margaret confirmed, meeting Carol's hostile gaze over the children's heads. As Carol herded the girls inside, Margaret remained in her car, watching until they disappeared. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with ignored messages, her assistant no doubt frantic, but she didn't care. For once, something mattered more than her empire. That night, alone in her penthouse overlooking the city lights, Margaret opened her laptop. Julia's research file sat in her inbox, marked urgent. She began to read, and what she found made her blood run cold. The custody situation was dire. Carol had made it clear to social services that she couldn't keep the girls permanently. No other family members had come forward. The girls were being evaluated for placement in foster care, likely to be split up since finding one home for 3 children was nearly impossible. Split up. Separated. These 3 sisters who had already lost everything would lose each other too. Margaret closed her laptop, walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and stared out at the city she'd conquered through sheer will and brilliant strategy. She'd built an empire from nothing, had overcome every obstacle through intelligence and determination. But all of that seemed suddenly meaningless compared to the problem before her. 3 children who needed a home. 3 children who'd already lost their mother and were about to lose each other. 3 children who, for reasons Margaret couldn't fully articulate, had awakened something in her she'd thought died with Sarah. The rational part of her brain cataloged all the reasons this was impossible. She was a CEO, constantly traveling, working insane hours. She had no experience with children, no support system for single parenthood. Her life was carefully structured around work and survival, with no room for the chaos that children inevitably brought. But another part of her, the part that had been numb for 3 years, whispered different truths. She had resources beyond most people's imagination. She could restructure her life if she chose. She had the power to solve this problem if she had the courage to try. Margaret thought about Sophie's ancient eyes, Emma's irrepressible joy despite everything, Lily's quiet wisdom. She thought about sitting in the cemetery together, sharing grief and finding unexpected comfort. She thought about how, for the first time since Sarah's death, she felt fully present in her own life, connected to something beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. She thought about Sarah, who'd wanted children so desperately, who'd made Margaret promise to live fully even after she was gone. Sarah, who believed in family and love and the importance of showing up for people who needed you. Margaret pulled out her phone and called Julia, despite the late hour. "I need you to set up a meeting," she said without preamble. "Tomorrow morning, first thing. Family law attorney, the best in the city. Tell them it's urgent. Tell them I want to discuss adoption." There was a long pause on the other end. "Adoption," Julia repeated carefully, as if she'd misheard. "Yes. 3 children, currently in temporary custody of their aunt, mother deceased, no viable family options. I want to know what's involved, what the process looks like, what obstacles we'll face." Another pause. Margaret, are you sure? This is a major decision. Maybe you should take some time to think about it. I've been thinking about nothing else for a week, Margaret replied. Set up the meeting. When she hung up, Margaret felt her heart racing, adrenaline surging through her veins. This was insane, reckless, completely illogical, everything her business training told her to avoid. But it was also the first thing that had felt completely right since the moment Sarah had taken her last breath. She returned to the window, looking out at the glittering city, and allowed herself to imagine a different future. Not the empty decades of work and loneliness she'd been trudging toward, but something else entirely. A future with small voices and laughter, with homework help and scraped knees, with a beautiful chaos that came from building a family not through biology, but through choice. The morning fog would return to the cemetery, the cycle of seasons continuing regardless of human grief. But Margaret Chen, who'd spent 3 years running from her pain, had finally stopped. And in stopping, in sitting still long enough to really see the world around her, she'd found 3 little girls who needed her. Or perhaps they'd found her. Perhaps Sarah had somehow orchestrated this from wherever souls went after the body failed. Perhaps this was grace, unexpected and undeserved, offered in the form of 3 orphaned children who'd stumbled into her grief and opened a door she'd thought permanently sealed. Margaret didn't believe in fate or destiny or divine intervention. She believed in data and strategy and calculated risk. But standing there in her empty penthouse, thinking about Sophie and Emma and Lily sleeping in their aunt's crowded apartment, she allowed herself to believe in one more thing: the possibility of second chances. Not to replace what she'd lost. Nothing could replace Sarah. But to honor that loss by creating something new, something that would give meaning to all the years she had left. To transform her grief into something generative rather than destructive. To finally let her love go somewhere. The decision settled over her like calm after a storm. She would fight for those children. She would use every resource at her disposal, leverage every connection, pull every string. She would become what they needed her to be: stable, present, committed. A mother not by birth but by fierce, deliberate choice. Margaret returned to her laptop and began making notes, her CEO brain already strategizing. First, the legal consultation to understand the process. Then building a support system, finding childcare, rearranging her schedule. She'd need to move, probably. The penthouse was no place for children. Somewhere with a yard, good schools nearby, room for 3 growing girls to spread out and be loud and messy and alive. The logistics were daunting, but not impossible. Nothing was impossible if you had enough resources and determination. And Margaret had both in abundance. As dawn began to break over the city, painting the sky in shades of hope, Margaret was still planning, still strategizing, still building the framework for a future she'd never imagined wanting. The sun rose on a new day, and Margaret Chen, who'd spent 3 years in darkness, finally stepped into the light. The law office of Patterson and Associates occupied the 42nd floor of a downtown high-rise, all glass and steel, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted wealth. Margaret sat across from Catherine Patterson, one of the most respected family law attorneys in the state, watching the woman's expression shift from professional interest to frank concern as she reviewed the file Julia had compiled. Ms. Chen, Catherine began, setting down the papers with deliberate care. I want to be completely honest with you about what you're proposing. Single adoption of 3 siblings by an unmarried CEO with no parenting experience and a demanding career is going to face significant scrutiny. Margaret had expected this. She'd spent the past 2 days researching adoption law, calling in favors, and mentally preparing for every obstacle. What kind of scrutiny? Catherine leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. Social services will question your motivations, your stability, your ability to provide consistent care. They'll want to know why you're suddenly interested in adoption after a brief encounter with these children. They'll dig into your personal life, your work schedule, your emotional state following your wife's death. I have unlimited resources, Margaret countered. I can hire the best nannies, provide the finest education, ensure they want for nothing. Money isn't the issue, Catherine said gently. In fact, it might work against you. The system is designed to protect children from being treated as accessories or projects. You'll need to prove this is about genuine commitment, not wealthy impulse or grief displacement. The words stung because they held truth. Was this grief displacement? Margaret had spent the past 3 days examining her motivations with brutal honesty, testing whether her desire to adopt stemmed from genuine care for the children or desperate need to fill the void Sarah left. The answer remained stubbornly complex, a mixture of both that refused simple categorization. I met them at my wife's grave, Margaret said quietly. They were visiting their mother. We connected over loss. And when I learned they were about to be separated and placed in foster care, I realized I have the power to prevent that, to give them stability and family. Is that not genuine enough? Catherine's expression softened slightly. It's a start, but you need to understand the timeline and requirements. Home studies, background checks, psychological evaluations, multiple interviews. The process typically takes 6 to 18 months, and that's if everything goes smoothly. These children are currently with their aunt, correct? Yes, Carol Morrison, but she's made it clear she doesn't want them permanently. That actually helps, Catherine admitted. If the biological family isn't contesting, it removes one major barrier. But you'll still face challenges. The court will want to see that you've established a genuine relationship with the children, that this isn't a whim. They'll want evidence of stability, a support system, a viable plan for balancing your career with parenting responsibilities. Margaret pulled out a leather portfolio, opened it to reveal pages of notes she'd compiled since her decision. I've already started. Here's my restructuring plan for Chen Technologies. I'm appointing David Torres as acting CEO for daily operations. I'll remain as chairman, but reduce my direct involvement by 60%. I've identified 3 properties suitable for children, all in excellent school districts. I have preliminary agreements with 2 childcare agencies specializing in trauma-informed care. And I'm prepared to take parenting classes, attend therapy, do whatever's required. Catherine looked genuinely impressed as she flipped through the documentation. You don't waste time, do you? I didn't build $1 billion company by hesitating, Margaret replied. When I identify a problem I can solve, I solve it. Children aren't problems, Catherine warned. And parenting isn't like running a company. You can't optimize family dynamics or restructure emotional needs. I understand that, Margaret said, though she wondered if she truly did. But I can provide stability. I can show up. I can learn. Isn't that enough? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret with the assessing gaze of someone who'd seen countless adoption cases succeed and fail. Finally, she nodded. Let's start the process. But Ms. Chen, I need you to prepare yourself for rejection and frustration. The system moves slowly, and it doesn't care about your usual methods of getting things done. You're going to need patience. Patience had never been Margaret's virtue, but she forced herself to nod. Whatever it takes. Over the following weeks, Margaret's carefully ordered life began to transform in ways both deliberate and unexpected. She met with social workers who peppered her with questions designed to probe every vulnerability. She submitted to background checks so thorough they examined elementary school records. She attended parenting workshops where she sat awkwardly among younger couples, taking notes with the same intensity she once applied to merger negotiations. But the most important changes were the Sundays. Every week, without fail, Margaret collected the girls for their cemetery visits. These afternoons evolved beyond grief rituals into something richer and more textured. They explored parks afterward, shared meals at casual restaurants the girls chose, visited libraries and museums. Margaret learned their individual personalities with increasing clarity. Sophie, the eldest at 9, carried responsibilities no child should bear. She watched over her sisters with maternal vigilance, always alert to danger or disappointment. She was whip-smart, devouring books Margaret brought her, asking probing questions about business and science and how the world worked. Emma, 8 years old and irrepressibly optimistic, found joy in everything despite her circumstances. She collected interesting rocks, made up elaborate stories about strangers they passed, and had an uncanny ability to make Margaret laugh when she least expected it. Emma's presence was like sunlight breaking through clouds, impossible to resist. Lily, the youngest at 7, remained quiet but observant. She spoke in whispers, but her words carried weight that belied her age. She noticed things others missed, reading emotions in faces and silences. She was the one who'd curl against Margaret during movies, who'd take her hand without asking, who seemed to sense when Margaret needed comfort as much as she provided it. They were becoming not just children Margaret spent time with, but individuals she genuinely cared for, whose happiness and well-being had become central to her thoughts. She found herself checking her phone during meetings, hoping for photos Julia had started taking during their outings. She kept their drawings in her office, taped to the window, where sunlight made the crayon colors glow. Carol remained hostile, viewing Margaret with suspicion that bordered on paranoia. During their weekly exchanges, she made pointed comments about wealthy people buying whatever they wanted, about Margaret's real motivations, about how the girls were getting attached to someone who'd inevitably disappear. "You think this is charity work?" Carol snapped one Sunday when Margaret arrived early. "Playing fairy godmother to make yourself feel better about your dead wife?" Margaret forced her voice to remain level. "I think these children deserve stability and love. I'm offering both." "For how long? Until the novelty wears off? Until your fancy lawyer realizes adoption is too complicated?" Carol lit a cigarette, blowing smoke in Margaret's direction. "Those girls have already lost their mother. I won't let you break their hearts too." "Then don't stand in the way of giving them a permanent home," Margaret replied quietly. Carol laughed, bitter and sharp. "A permanent home in some sterile penthouse with a workaholic CEO? Real children need more than money, lady. They need someone who actually knows how to be a parent." The accusation cut deeper than Margaret expected, mainly because it echoed her own doubts. She did work constantly, had structured her entire adult life around career achievement. She had no idea how to be a parent, no model to follow. Her own parents had been distant, more concerned with financial survival than emotional connection. Sarah would have known how to do this, but Sarah was gone. Yet watching the girls pile in her car, their faces lighting up when they saw her, Margaret felt certain of one thing. Whatever she lacked in experience, she made up for in determination. She would learn. She would adapt. She would become what they needed. The home study arrived like a storm in late November. A social worker named Patricia Mills appeared at Margaret's penthouse, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp with professional skepticism. She walked through the space slowly, noting the expensive furniture, the art collection, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views. "This is quite impressive," Patricia said neutrally. "Though I noticed there's nothing here for children. No toys, no color, no evidence that kids would be welcome in this space." "I'm planning to move," Margaret explained. "This apartment isn't suitable for a family. I've been looking at houses with yards in neighborhoods with good schools and parks nearby." Patricia made notes. "How long have you lived here?" 8 years. My wife and I moved in together when we got married." "And after she passed, you stayed?" Margaret hesitated, recognizing the trap. "Yes, I suppose I was avoiding change." "But now you're ready for significant change? 3 children represent enormous disruption to your current lifestyle. What makes you confident you can handle that?" The questions continued for hours. Patricia examined every aspect of Margaret's life with methodical thoroughness. She reviewed financial records, asked about Margaret's childhood, probed her relationship with Sarah, questioned her understanding of trauma and grief in children. "These girls have experienced profound loss," Patricia said, her tone softening slightly. "They'll need therapy, patience, understanding when they act out or regress. Parenting traumatized children isn't the same as raising kids who've had stable, secure attachment from birth." "I understand that," Margaret replied. "I'm prepared to do whatever's necessary. Therapy for them, therapy for me, specialized training, support groups. I have resources to provide every advantage." Resources aren't the same as readiness, Patricia countered. Tell me, Ms. Chen, what happens when Sophie has a panic attack at 3 in the morning? When Emma's grief manifests as aggression at school? When Lily stops eating because she's terrified of losing another caregiver? Will your resources handle those moments, or will you? Margaret met the social worker's challenging gaze. I will, because I've lived through grief too. I know what it's like to lose the person who defined your world. I know how it feels when everyone expects you to be fine, to move on, to function normally when everything inside is shattered. I can't promise I'll do everything right, but I promise I'll show up. Every time, no matter what. Something shifted in Patricia's expression, assessment giving way to cautious consideration. Why these children specifically? You could adopt infants with far less complication. Why take on 3 older children with trauma and attachment issues? Margaret thought about that morning in the fog-wrapped cemetery, about 3 small girls offering wilted dandelions and understanding that transcended age, about Sophie's protective fierceness, Emma's resilient joy, Lily's quiet wisdom, about how they'd awakened something in her that she'd thought permanently extinguished. Because they found me when I needed finding, Margaret said simply. And because I think maybe I found them when they needed it too. I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for real. Patricia studied her for a long moment, then closed her notebook. I'll be honest, Ms. Chen. This is unconventional. Single adoptive parents face challenges. Successful businesswomen face assumptions about their priorities, and adopting 3 siblings simultaneously is complex even in ideal circumstances. You're going to face resistance. But, Margaret prompted, hearing the unspoken qualification. But I've seen enough failed placements to know that resources and determination matter. And I've seen the way those girls talk about you. Sophie told me you're the only adult who doesn't treat them like they're broken. Emma said you laugh at her jokes even when they're not funny. Lily said you smell like hope. Patricia's professional mask cracked slightly, revealing genuine emotion. That last one especially stuck with me. Margaret felt her throat tighten. What happens next? More evaluations. Background checks on anyone who'll be involved in the children's care. Home visits once you've moved. Supervise interactions to assess attachment and compatibility. References from colleagues and friends. Psychological assessment to ensure you're emotionally stable. The process is invasive and exhausting by design. I can handle invasive and exhausting, Margaret said. I've been living that way for 3 years. Patricia nodded slowly. I believe you might actually be serious about this. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. As Patricia left, Margaret stood at the window, looking out over the city, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. This was really happening. She was really doing this. No turning back now, no neat exit strategy if things got difficult. She was choosing complexity and chaos over the comfortable numbness she'd inhabited since Sarah's death. That night, Margaret video called her closest friend and Chen Technologies' chief operating officer, James Park. They'd known each other since graduate school, had built the company together, and he was one of the few people who'd witnessed both her rise and her collapse after losing Sarah. Let me make sure I understand, James said, his face filling her laptop screen. You're adopting 3 children you met at a cemetery a month ago? Yes. Margaret, I love you, but have you lost your mind? She smiled despite the weight of the question. Possibly. Probably. Does it matter? James ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as his processing mode. Look, I support you. Always have, always will. But this is massive. You're talking about completely restructuring your life for kids you barely know. What if it doesn't work? What if you realize you're not cut out for parenting? What happens to those children then? I won't let that happen, Margaret said firmly. You can't guarantee that. Parenting isn't like business, Mags. You can't control outcomes through strategy and effort. Kids are unpredictable. They're demanding and messy, and they'll expose every limitation you have. I know. Do you? James leaned forward, his expression serious. Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like you're trying to fix your grief by taking on someone else's. And that's not fair to you or those kids. The accusation landed hard because Margaret had asked herself the same question repeatedly. Was this about the children or about filling the Sarah-shaped hole in her life? She'd examined her motivations from every angle, tested her resolve against worst-case scenarios, and the answer remained frustratingly nuanced. Maybe it started that way, Margaret admitted, but it's become something different. I genuinely care about Sophie, Emma, and Lily, not as Sarah replacements or grief projects, but as themselves, as three remarkable humans who deserve better than the hand they've been dealt. And I have the power to give them better. How can I not try? James was quiet for a moment. You really mean this? I really do. He sighed, but his expression softened. Then you have my complete support. Whatever you need, from reducing your responsibilities to rearranging the board structure to covering for you when parenting crises inevitably happen, I'm there. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. Just promise me one thing, James added. Promise you'll take care of yourself, too. You've been running on grief and guilt for 3 years. Make sure you're healing, not just transferring your pain into a different project. After the call ended, Margaret sat with his words, turning them over in her mind. Was she healing or transferring? The distinction felt important but elusive. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps healing required exactly this kind of transfer, channeling destructive grief into constructive action, transforming loss into the creation of something new. December arrived with unexpected warmth, the city decorated for holidays that felt surreal to Margaret. She'd avoided celebrating anything since Sarah died, treating December like any other month of work and survival. But the girls changed that calculation. They dragged her to see Christmas lights, insisted on decorating cookies together, made her help them pick out gifts for Carol from the dollar store. Their enthusiasm was infectious, chipping away at Margaret's carefully maintained emotional distance from joy. On the third Sunday of December, during their usual cemetery visit, something shifted. They'd finished their ritual at both graves when Emma suddenly asked, Margaret, can we call you something else? Using your whole name feels too formal when you're like family now. Margaret's heart stuttered. What would you want to call me? The girls exchanged glances, some silent negotiation happening in looks and tiny gestures. Finally, Lily whispered, could we try Mama Margaret? Or is that wrong, because you weren't our real mama's friend? The question hung in the cold air, full of hope and fear and the desperate need for permission to attach to someone new. Margaret knelt in the grass, bringing herself to their level, and found her voice thick with emotion. Your mother will always be your mother, she said carefully. Nothing changes that or replaces her. But if you want to call me Mama Margaret, I would be honored. So honored. Sophie stepped forward, her ancient eyes bright with unshed tears. We talked about it, all three of us. We decided that maybe love doesn't run out. Maybe you can love someone who's gone and someone who's here at the same time. And maybe calling you Mama doesn't mean forgetting our real Mama. It just means making room for more love. Margaret pulled all three of them in her arms, this tangle of small bodies and big feelings, and let herself cry openly. Your mother raised incredibly wise daughters, she managed. She will be so proud of you. They stood there together, 5 people bound by loss and choice, and Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her. This wasn't about replacing Sarah or the girls replacing Rebecca. This was about building something entirely new from the raw materials of grief, creating family not from biology, but from the deliberate decision to show up for each other despite and because of their wounds. From that day forward, she was Mama Margaret, at least when they were alone together. The name felt strange in her mouth at first, weighty with responsibility and terrifying in its implications. But each time one of the girls said it, casual and easy as if she'd always been their Mama Margaret, something inside her healed incrementally. The adoption process ground forward with bureaucratic slowness. More interviews, more evaluations, more scrutiny of every aspect of Margaret's life and character. She bought a house in early January, a sprawling craftsman with a large yard, walking distance from an excellent elementary school. The girls helped her decorate their potential rooms, arguing cheerfully about paint colors and furniture arrangements. Carol's hostility intensified as Margaret's intentions became undeniable. She started making excuses to cut their visits short, questioning Margaret's every decision, planting seeds of doubt in the girls' minds about whether this wealthy stranger would really follow through. "She's scared," Patricia explained during one of their regular check-ins. "Scared of losing control, scared of being seen as the aunt who gave them away, scared that if this works, it proves she could have tried harder. Fear makes people cruel." Margaret tried to sympathize, but her patience wore thin as Carol's interference escalated. She started forgetting about scheduled visits, claiming the girls were sick when they clearly weren't, making increasingly unreasonable demands about when and where Margaret could see them. The situation came to a head in late January when Margaret arrived for their Sunday visit to find Carol refusing to open the door. "They're not going with you today," Carol shouted through the barrier. "Or any day. I've been thinking, and this whole thing is insane. I'm her blood family. The courts will side with me if I fight this." Margaret kept her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Carol, please. The girls are expecting me. You're confusing them and causing unnecessary pain." "Unnecessary? You're the one trying to buy my sister's children." The door remained closed, but Margaret could hear crying from inside. The girls, distressed by the conflict, their voices raised in protest. It took every ounce of Margaret's self-control not to break down that door, to demand access to children who were calling for her. Instead, she called Catherine Patterson. Within 48 hours, they were in family court. Catherine had filed an emergency petition based on Carol's increasingly erratic behavior and the documented bond between Margaret and the children. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, reviewed the case with practiced efficiency. Carol arrived with a court-appointed attorney, her face flushed and defensive. "Your Honor, this woman is trying to steal my nieces. She's rich and powerful and thinks she can just take whatever she wants. I'm their family, blood family." Ms. Morrison, Judge Chen said calmly, "According to the social worker's reports, you've repeatedly stated you cannot keep the children permanently. Is that correct?" Carol shifted uncomfortably. "I said it's difficult, not impossible. With the right support, I could manage. But you've also missed multiple therapy sessions the court ordered for the children, failed to maintain stable housing, and according to the school, Emma and Sophie have each missed over 20 days this semester due to your work schedule conflicts. Is this accurate?" "I'm doing my best," Carol said, voice rising. "I have a newborn and a job and no help. It's not fair to judge me." Judge Chen turned to Margaret. "Ms. Chen, you're a CEO of a major corporation. How do you plan to balance the demands of 3 children with your professional responsibilities?" Margaret stood, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "I've restructured my role to reduce direct oversight by 60%. I've hired a support team, including a specialized nanny, arranged flexible work-from-home options, and committed to prioritizing the children's needs above professional advancement. My company supports this transition fully. And you understand these children have experienced trauma? That adoption won't magically resolve their grief and behavioral challenges?" "I understand completely, Your Honor. I've completed trauma-informed parenting courses, arranged ongoing therapy for all 3 girls, and committed to family counseling. I don't expect this to be easy. I expect it to be necessary." The judge reviewed documents silently, the courtroom holding its collective breath. Finally, she spoke. "I'm granting temporary custody to Ms. Margaret Chen, effective immediately, pending completion of the adoption process. The children will reside with her while final evaluations are completed. Ms. Morrison, you'll have supervised visitation rights twice monthly." Carol's face crumpled. "You're giving my sister's children to a stranger?" "I'm placing them with someone who's demonstrated consistent commitment to their well-being," Judge Chen corrected firmly. "Someone who's built a relationship with them and has the resources to provide stability they desperately need. This is in the children's best interest." When Margaret left the courthouse, Catherine beside her, she felt dizzy with relief and terror in equal measure. Temporary custody. The girls would come home with her today. This was happening. This was real. Sophie, Emma, and Lily had been waiting in a separate room with a social worker. When Patricia brought them out and explained the judge's decision, Emma burst into tears of joy, throwing herself at Margaret. Sophie looked stunned, as if afraid to believe good news. Lily simply took Margaret's hand and held on tight, her small fingers intertwining with Margaret's larger ones. "We get to live with you?" Sophie asked, voice small. "For real?" "For real," Margaret confirmed, kneeling to embrace all three. "Welcome home." That evening, Margaret stood in the doorway of her new house watching the girls explore their rooms with wonder. They moved tentatively at first, as if afraid this dream might dissolve, touching furniture and walls like confirming solidity. Emma bounced on her bed, testing its comfort. Sophie examined the bookshelf Margaret had filled with titles she thought would interest her. Lily stood at her window, looking out at the backyard where a swing set waited. This was her family now. These three brilliant, damaged, resilient children were her responsibility, her joy, her greatest challenge. Margaret felt the weight of it settle over her like a mantle, heavy but somehow right. She thought about Sarah, wondered what her wife would think of this transformation. Sarah, who'd wanted children so desperately. Sarah, who'd believed in chosen family and the power of showing up for people who needed you. Margaret hoped, wherever Sarah was, she approved of this unlikely path toward healing. The girls gathered in the kitchen for their first family dinner, simple pasta and salad. Nothing fancy, but made with care. They ate together at the table Margaret had bought specifically for this moment, big enough for everyone with room for growth. "Mama Margaret?" Emma asked between bites. "Is this really forever?" Margaret looked at each of them in turn, these three faces that had become as familiar as her own. "This is really forever," she promised. "You're mine now, and I'm yours. We're family." Sophie reached across the table, taking Margaret's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for choosing us." But Margaret knew the truth was more complex. They'd chosen each other in a fog-wrapped cemetery through shared grief and gradual trust. This wasn't rescue or charity. This was mutual salvation, broken pieces finding ways to fit together into something new and whole. Outside, night fell over the city. Inside, Margaret Chen and her three daughters began the messy, beautiful work of becoming a family. The battle for custody was won, but the real challenge was just beginning, learning to live together, to heal together, to build a home from the ruins of loss. And for the first time in 3 years, Margaret faced that challenge not with dread, but with hope. The first morning arrived with chaos Margaret hadn't anticipated. She woke to the sound of crying at 4:30, stumbled down the hallway still half asleep, and found Lily sitting bolt upright in bed, tears streaming down her face, caught in the grip of a nightmare she couldn't articulate. Margaret gathered the small girl into her arms, rocking her gently while whispering reassurances that felt inadequate against whatever terrors lived in a 7-year-old subconscious. By the time Lily had calmed enough to sleep again, Emma was awake and hungry, wandering into the kitchen expecting breakfast. Margaret, who normally survived on black coffee until noon, found herself attempting pancakes at 5 in the morning, consulting a recipe on her phone while Emma sat at the counter offering helpful commentary about how her mother used to make them. Sophie appeared around 6, already dressed, her expression cautious. She watched Margaret flip misshapen pancakes with the critical eye of someone assessing competence. When Margaret slid a plate toward her, Sophie examined it carefully before taking a tentative bite. "These are different than Mama's," Sophie said diplomatically. "Different bad or different okay?" Margaret asked, genuinely uncertain. Sophie chewed thoughtfully. "Different okay. You'll get better with practice." It became the theme of those early weeks. Everything was different okay, a phrase that captured the strange liminal space they inhabited together. Not the family they'd lost, not yet the family they were becoming, but something in between that required patience and grace from everyone involved. Margaret learned quickly that running a household with 3 children bore no resemblance to managing a corporation. There were no efficiency metrics for soothing hurt feelings or logical frameworks for resolving disputes over whose turn it was to choose the movie. Her executive skills translated poorly to debates about appropriate bedtimes and whether vegetables were truly necessary at every meal. The girls tested boundaries with the ruthless efficiency of seasoned negotiators. Emma pushed hardest, sensing Margaret's inexperience and exploiting every hesitation. She stayed up past bedtime, claiming she wasn't tired. She refused vegetables, insisting her mother never made her eat them, a claim Sophie immediately contradicted. She had spectacular meltdowns in grocery stores when Margaret said no to sugary cereals. Sophie tested differently, through excessive responsibility and perfectionism. She tried to parent her sisters, correcting their behavior and managing their emotions, taking on burdens no 9-year-old should carry. When Margaret gently suggested Sophie didn't need to be in charge, the girl looked genuinely confused, as if releasing control might mean everything would fall apart. Lily's tests were quietest, but perhaps most heartbreaking. She hoarded food in her room, stashing crackers and granola bars under her mattress like someone preparing for famine. She asked repeatedly when they'd have to leave, when Margaret would decide they were too much trouble, when the real goodbye would come. "This is your home," Margaret told her over and over. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." But Lily's eyes held doubt born from experience. Adults left. Promises broke. Security was an illusion that shattered without warning. Words meant nothing. Only time would prove truth. Margaret called Patricia weekly, sometimes daily, seeking guidance for challenges she'd never imagined. How to handle Sophie's anxiety about school performance. What to do when Emma hit another child who'd teased her about being adopted. How to respond when Lily wet the bed, mortified and certain she'd be punished. "You're doing fine," Patricia assured her during one particularly frazzled call. "Nobody's perfect at this, Margaret. The fact that you're asking questions and seeking help means you're taking it seriously." "I feel like I'm failing constantly," Margaret admitted. "Every decision feels wrong. Every response inadequate." "Welcome to parenting," Patricia said with a hint of amusement. "That feeling never completely goes away. You just get more comfortable with uncertainty." Uncertainty had never been Margaret's friend. She'd built her career on careful analysis and calculated risk, on gathering sufficient data before making informed decisions. But parenting offered no such luxury. She had to act in real time with incomplete information, trusting instinct she wasn't sure she possessed. Work suffered inevitably. Margaret missed her first board meeting ever, staying home when Emma spiked a fever and refused to let anyone but Mama Margaret near her. She conducted conference calls with one eye on Sophie's homework, trying to help with fractions while negotiating terms with potential investors. She turned down a lucrative contract in Singapore because it required 2 weeks of travel, and she couldn't imagine leaving the girls that long. James covered for her beautifully, running interference with board members who questioned her commitment. But Margaret heard the whispers anyway, the speculation about whether she could handle both motherhood and leadership, whether her grief had finally broken her in ways that made her unreliable. Let them whisper. For the first time in her professional life, Margaret didn't care what boardrooms thought of her. She had more important concerns, like whether Lily would ever trust that food would always be available, or if Sophie would learn that she didn't have to be perfect to be loved, or when Emma would stop acting out her anger at a universe that had stolen her mother. Therapy helped. Margaret had found Dr. Vivian Torres, a child psychologist specializing in grief and adoption trauma. The girls saw her individually and together, slowly unpacking feelings too complex and painful for their young hearts to carry alone. Dr. Torres also met with Margaret, teaching her to recognize signs of dysregulation, to respond to behavior as communication rather than disobedience. When Emma throws a tantrum about vegetables, she's not actually upset about vegetables, Dr. Torres explained. She's testing whether you'll abandon her when she's difficult. Every no she pushes against is really asking, "Will you stay even if I'm not perfect?" Understanding the subtext transformed everything. Margaret learned to hold boundaries while also affirming love, to be consistent without being rigid, to recognize that discipline and devotion weren't opposites, but partners in building security. The breakthrough with Emma came on a rainy Tuesday in March. Margaret had said no to something, she couldn't even remember what, and Emma had exploded with volcanic fury. She screamed that Margaret wasn't her real mother, could never be her real mother, that she hated her and wished she'd never met her. Margaret's instinct was to retreat, to protect herself from words that landed like blows. But Dr. Torres's voice echoed in her head. This is the test. This is when you prove you're different. Instead of leaving, Margaret sat on the floor outside Emma's locked bedroom door and spoke through the barrier. I know you're angry. I know you miss your mama, and nothing I do will ever replace her. But I'm not going anywhere, Emma. You can scream at me, hate me, push me away, and I'll still be here tomorrow. Because that's what mothers do. We stay. Silence from inside the room. Then, so quietly Margaret almost missed it. Promise? I promise. The door opened slowly. Emma stood there, face blotchy from crying, defiance warring with desperate hope. Margaret opened her arms, and Emma crashed into them, sobbing the kind of tears that released rather than expressed pain. They sat together on the hallway floor until Emma had cried herself out, until the storm passed and left exhausted peace in its wake. After that, something shifted. Emma still tested, still pushed boundaries, but the edge of desperation dulled. She began to believe, tentatively, that this new mother might actually keep her promises. Sophie's transformation was slower, more gradual. It began with small permissions, to make mistakes on homework, to ask for help instead of struggling alone, to be a child rather than a miniature adult. Margaret had to consciously stop relying on Sophie's competence, had to resist the temptation to treat her as a co-parent rather than a daughter who deserved to play and be irresponsible sometimes. The turning point came when Sophie's school called. She'd had a panic attack during a math test, hyperventilating so severely they'd called an ambulance. Margaret arrived at the hospital to find Sophie pale and mortified, convinced she'd disappointed everyone, that her panic proved she was broken and unworthy of her new home. Margaret climbed onto the hospital bed, gathered Sophie close, and held her while speaking truths the girl needed to hear. You're 9 years old. You've survived losing your mother, living with an aunt who resented you, and adjusting to a completely new family. A panic attack doesn't make you broken. It makes you human, and you don't have to be perfect for me to love you. You just have to be you. Sophie cried then, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to release years of held tension. When she could speak, she whispered, I'm so tired of being brave. Then don't be, Margaret said simply. Let me be brave for both of us for a while. Something fundamental loosened in Sophie after that day. She started bringing her worries to Margaret instead of handling them alone. She laughed more freely, complained about normal kid things like chores and bedtime. She became, slowly, the child she should have been allowed to be all along. Lily's healing was most fragile, most easily disrupted by unexpected changes or transitions. She still checked the pantry compulsively, still asked when they'd have to leave, still woke from nightmares where Margaret disappeared like morning fog. But gradually, so gradually Margaret almost missed the shifts, Lily began to trust. It started with small things. Leaving her hoarded food under the bed instead of panic eating it all immediately. Going a week without asking when they'd have to move. Sitting on Margaret's lap while watching movies without checking constantly to make sure she was still there. The real breakthrough came on Mother's Day, for months after the girls had moved in. Margaret woke to find all three of them crowded into her bedroom, carrying a tray with burnt toast and oversweetened coffee they'd made themselves. But it was the card that made Margaret's breath catch. It was handmade, decorated with crayon drawings of 4 figures holding hands. Inside, in 3 different handwriting styles, they'd each written a message. Sophie's was carefully printed. Thank you for choosing us when you didn't have to. Emma's was enthusiastic and messy. Best mama ever. Lily's was smallest, squeezed at the bottom. You stayed. 2 words that contained universes. You stayed. The ultimate test, the only proof that mattered. Margaret had stayed through tantrums and tears, through nightmares and negotiations, through every difficult moment when walking away would have been easier. And in staying, she'd proven something words could never convey. She was trustworthy. Margaret pulled all three girls into bed with her, the four of them tangled together in blankets and morning light. "I love you," she told them, speaking the words that had become easier each time she said them. "Not for who you might become or how well you behave. I love you because you're mine, and I'm yours, and nothing will ever change that." The adoption finalization hearing happened on a perfect June morning. Judge Chen presided again, her stern face softening when the girls entered the courtroom in matching dresses they'd picked out specially for the occasion. Carol was absent, having signed away her rights weeks earlier, unable to maintain opposition when faced with the obvious bond between Margaret and the children. The proceeding was surprisingly brief. Patricia testified about Margaret's transformation as a parent, about the stability and love she'd provided. Dr. Torres spoke about the girls' healing, about attachment, forming healthy and strong. Even the school principal appeared, describing how all three children had flourished academically and socially since moving in with Margaret. Judge Chen asked the girls if they wanted to be adopted by Margaret. Emma shouted yes, immediately, making the courtroom laugh. Sophie nodded seriously, her hand tight in Margaret's. Lily whispered, "Please," so softly the judge had to ask her to repeat it. "Then it is my honor," Judge Chen said, voice carrying genuine warmth, "to grant this adoption. Sophie, Emma, and Lily Morrison are hereby and forever the legal daughters of Margaret Chen. This family is official in the eyes of the law." The gavel came down, and Emma shrieked with joy. Sophie cried quietly, smiling through tears. Lily pressed her face into Margaret's shoulder, holding on tight. Margaret felt something click into place inside her chest. A puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing finally settling into its proper position. They celebrated that night with pizza and ice cream. Let the girls stay up far too late, took approximately 300 photos to commemorate the day. When Margaret finally tucked them into bed, exhausted and happy, she stood in the hallway between their three rooms and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. She'd come to a cemetery to mourn what she'd lost. Instead, she found what she hadn't known she was seeking: a second chance at family, at love, at building something beautiful from the ruins of grief. Sarah would have loved these girls, would have been so proud of Margaret for choosing courage over comfort, connection over isolation. Later, alone in her room, Margaret pulled out the card the girls had made. She read their messages again, tears tracking down her face, and whispered to Sarah's memory, "I hope I'm doing this right. I hope you see them, wherever you are. I hope you know I finally understand what you meant about family being who you choose." The cemetery visits continued, but they evolved. Instead of solo mourning, Margaret brought the girls every few weeks. They'd visit both Rebecca's and Sarah's graves, bringing flowers and stories, introducing the two women who'd never met in life, but whose losses had brought their families together. One Sunday, standing between the two headstones with her daughters, Margaret realized she could finally think about Sarah without the crushing weight of guilt and regret. The grief remained, would always remain, but it had transformed into something gentler. Love had found somewhere to go, channeled into raising three remarkable children who needed her as much as she needed them. "Tell us about Sarah," Sophie asked, settling on the grass. It had become their ritual, sharing stories of the mothers they'd lost, keeping memories alive through narrative. Margaret sat beside her, Emma and Lily curling close, and began to speak. She told them about Sarah's terrible sense of direction, her collection of dying houseplants, her belief that family was built through showing up, through choosing each other again and again, even when it was difficult. "She sounds like she would have been a great mama," Emma said. "She would have loved you all so much," Margaret agreed. "Just like your mama would have been proud of how brave and kind you are." Lily leaned her head against Margaret's shoulder. "Do you think they know each other now? Our mamas?" Margaret looked at the two graves, imagining Sarah and Rebecca somehow connected in whatever came after life. "I like to think they do. I like to imagine them being friends, watching over all of us together." "That's nice," Lily said softly. Not being alone, even there. They sat together, as afternoon light slanted gold through the trees. For people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, who'd chosen to become family not through biology, but through the deliberate decision to show up for each other's pain and joy alike. Margaret's phone buzzed with messages from the office. Always some crisis demanding attention, some decision only she could make. But for once, she silenced it without checking, staying present in this moment with her daughters. These three remarkable humans who'd taught her that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about building a future spacious enough to hold both loss and love. As they walked back to the car, Emma slipped her hand into Margaret's. "Mama Margaret?" "Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you found us that day. Even though it was sad, finding each other, I'm glad." "Me too," Margaret said, squeezing the small hand in hers. "Me too." Sophie walked on her other side, Lily riding piggyback, and Margaret felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was her family now, imperfect and beautiful and built from broken pieces that had somehow fit together into something whole. She'd gone to a cemetery to mourn her past. Instead, she'd found her future waiting there, in the form of three little girls who'd needed someone to choose them, to stay, to prove through daily presence that love could be rebuilt after loss. Margaret Chen had spent 3 years running from grief. But sometimes she learned you had to stop running and sit still in the pain long enough to see what else was there. Sometimes the only way through grief was to open yourself to new love, not as replacement, but as transformation. That night, tucking each girl in a bed, Margaret whispered the same words she'd spoken every night since the adoption finalized. "You're mine, and I'm yours, and nothing will ever change that. I promise." And for the first time since Sarah's death, Margaret understood that promises weren't about guaranteeing a perfect future. They were about committing to show up, day after day, through every challenge and joy, choosing love again and again, even when it was difficult or frightening or uncertain. She turned off the lights and stood in the hallway, listening to her daughter's quiet breathing, and felt peace settle over her like benediction. This was home. This was family. This was love finally finding somewhere to go. Outside, stars emerged in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more moments of uncertainty, endless opportunities to question whether she was doing this parenting thing right. But tonight, Margaret Chen rested in the knowledge that she'd done the one thing that mattered most. She'd stayed. And in staying, she discovered that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey. Not something achieved alone, but built together, one imperfect day at a time, with people who chose to walk beside you through the darkness until gradually light returned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.